Waitress refused to serve by racist customers. What she did next shocked the whole restaurant. The clinking of silverware and the steady hum of voices filled the restaurant, a constant backdrop to her daily routine. The smell of frying onions and butter clung to the air, drifting through the aisles as she wove between tables with practiced ease. The black waitress adjusted the tray balanced on her arm, her movements smooth and efficient, honed from years of carrying too many plates and never letting a single one slip. She wore her uniform neatly, her apron tied snugly, her hair pulled back in a way that kept it tidy no matter how many hours she worked. Her coworkers admired her, even if they rarely said it outright. The newer servers often watched her out of the corners of their eyes, learning how she could take 3 tables' orders in one pass without missing a detail, how she refilled a child's soda before he even had the chance to ask, how she calmed an impatient diner with nothing more than a soft word and a steady smile. The cooks in the back respected her too, knowing she would never bark at them in anger when an order was delayed, but she also would never hesitate to defend them if a customer tried to lay blame unfairly. She was the kind of employee managers relied on, steady and dependable, the quiet backbone of the evening shift. But respect behind the counter was not the same as recognition in the dining room. Too often, the customers who sat beneath the warm lights and ate from the plates she carried barely looked at her. To them, she was just another waitress, someone to serve and then fade away once their needs were met. She heard their clipped tones when they placed orders, saw the way their eyes slid past her when they spoke, and felt the sting of their impatience when she was not at their table quickly enough. Some called her girl instead of reading her name off the tag pinned neatly to her chest. Others handed her their credit cards without meeting her eyes, as though she were part of the furniture rather than a person standing in front of them. Still, she carried on with quiet dignity. Every table she served mattered to her, even if they never thanked her. She knew which regular liked extra lemon in his water, which family always asked for crayons for their children, which elderly woman preferred her soup lukewarm rather than hot. These details she carried like secrets, her way of reminding herself that she was more than invisible. Her pride came not from their acknowledgement but from her own commitment to doing her work with care. There were moments when she caught her reflection in the restaurant's wide front windows as she hurried past, her back straight, her steps firm, her tray balanced perfectly. In those glimpses, she reminded herself that strength was not always loud, and dignity did not require applause. She had carved out her worth in the way she moved through each shift, unseen but unbroken. Yet beneath the routine lingered a quiet ache, the sense that she gave so much of herself in service to people who rarely saw her as anything more than a hand delivering their plates. She did not dwell on it during the rush of dinner hours, but the weight of it never left her. She carried it in silence, the same way she carried everything else. The dinner rush had begun to swell, the hum of conversation rising above the clatter of dishes and the hiss of the kitchen grill. She moved quickly through the aisles, weaving between tables with her notepad in hand, her smile steady even as her feet ached from the hours she had already worked. The restaurant pulsed with life. Families gathered in booths, couples leaning close over candlelit tables, and children coloring in the paper menus. For her, it was the familiar rhythm of a long shift, one she had learned to carry with grace. The door swung open, and a group of men entered, their voices already loud, their laughter sharp in a way that cut through the easy chatter of the room. Heads turned briefly before looking away, but she noticed immediately the shift in the air. Their swagger carried entitlement, their steps heavy with the confidence of those who believed every room belonged to them. The host greeted them politely and led them toward her section, sliding menus onto a booth that had just been cleaned. She steadied her breath, tucked her pen against the notepad, and walked toward them with the same professionalism she gave every guest. As she arrived at the table, her voice calm and welcoming, she asked if she could start them off with drinks. One of the men leaned back against the booth, his smirk twisting into something colder. He looked her up and down slowly, then turned to his friends, making sure his voice carried across the restaurant. "We don't want her," he said. loud enough for nearby tables to hear. His words hung in the air, dripping with disdain. She blinked, her smile faltering only slightly as her pen stilled above the paper. Before she could respond, another man leaned forward, elbows on the table, his grin wide with mockery. "Yeah, send someone else. We don't want to be served by her." He spat the last word with emphasis, making no effort to hide the venom. The sound seemed to ripple across the room. Conversations quieted. Forks paused midair, and eyes lifted toward the booth. A few diners glanced at one another, their discomfort plain. Some looked quickly away, pretending they had not heard, while others lingered, caught between curiosity and unease. Her chest tightened, the sting immediate, but she stood tall. The words cut deeper because of their deliberate cruelty, their need to make sure everyone around them had heard. They could have whispered. They could have asked quietly for another server. Instead, they had chosen humiliation, wielding it like a weapon to strip her dignity in front of strangers. She looked at them, her face composed even as her heart pounded. The man nearest her leaned back farther, satisfied with the silence he had created. "Go get someone else," he added, his tone dismissive, as though she were nothing more than an obstacle. His friends chuckled, their voices a low rumble of agreement, their smirks wide and cruel. She tightened her grip on the notepad, forcing herself not to let it tremble. Around her, the restaurant remained quiet, the weight of their words pressing into the stillness. She felt every pair of eyes, every judgment, every ounce of pity and discomfort radiating from the room. The men reclined in their booth, smug, certain they had made their point. They believed they had reminded her of her place, that they had stripped her down to nothing more than the uniform she wore. She drew a breath, steadying herself, her silence sharper than any reply she might have given. She refused to let them see her break, even as the cruelty of their refusal echoed in her mind. They had wanted the entire room to hear, and now it had. But what they did not realize was that others had heard something else as well, something that would not be forgotten. The booth erupted in laughter that was not joyous but sharp, carrying through the restaurant like a cruel performance. The men leaned back in their seats, exchanging looks of satisfaction as though they had won something, as though belittling her in public had given them a kind of power. Their voices carried deliberately, ensuring that no one could pretend not to hear. The words lingered in the air, settling over the tables around them like a heavy cloud. At a booth nearby, a young couple paused mid-conversation. The woman's eyes darted to the waitress, her face flushed with sympathy. But her companion shook his head subtly, urging her to look away. At another table, a family with 2 children sat frozen. The father cleared his throat loudly and reached for his water, desperate to create noise that might erase the tension, while the mother's lips pressed into a thin line, her gaze fixed firmly on the menu. 2 teenagers at the counter whispered and snickered, nudging each other's shoulders, their discomfort manifesting as laughter. Not everyone mocked her, but few dared to challenge what had just been said. Most simply sank into silence, pretending the moment had not happened, leaving her alone in the glare of unwanted attention. The sting spread through her body, a heat rising from her chest to her cheeks, her pulse pounding in her ears. She held her notepad tightly against her side, her fingers pressed so hard into the cardboard backing that her knuckles whitened. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, to turn and walk away with her dignity unshaken, but the weight of all those eyes froze her in place. The room had grown quieter, the energy shifting from bustling chatter to an uneasy hush. Even the clatter of dishes from the kitchen seemed to dim. Behind the counter, her co-workers had noticed. One of the younger waitresses, balancing a tray of drinks, lingered too long in the doorway to the dining room, her mouth open slightly as though she wanted to say something. Another busboy stood with a stack of dishes in his hands, his gaze fixed on the floor. The manager peeked out from his office briefly before retreating, the door closing again, as if he had decided it was easier not to intervene. They all saw what was happening. They all knew the sting of those words, but hesitation kept them frozen, unwilling to risk becoming targets themselves. The men at the booth smirked, basking in the silence they had created. One leaned forward on his elbows, glancing around at the other diners as though daring anyone to object. When no one did, he leaned back again with a satisfied grin. Another reached for his glass, taking a slow sip of water while never breaking eye contact with her, his stare heavy with mockery. Their laughter returned in low bursts, confident that they had proven their point. She drew in a breath, steadying herself as best she could. The humiliation cut deeply, but she refused to let her body collapse under the weight of it. She forced her shoulders back, her spine straight, her face calm even though her heart thudded with pain. They wanted to see her crumble, to watch her dignity fall apart in front of everyone. Instead, she gave them silence, a quiet strength that was all she had left in that moment. The customers believed they had stripped her down, but what they did not realize was that their cruelty had been witnessed by all. The memory of that moment would linger, and their smirks, though confident now, would not hold forever. The silence around the booth lingered like smoke, heavy and suffocating. The men who had dismissed her leaned back in their seats with smug grins, convinced their words had put her in her place. Her chest tightened with humiliation, but she would not give them what they wanted. She adjusted the notepad in her hand, lifted her chin slightly, and drew in a steady breath. Her back straightened, her shoulders squared, and without a word she turned and moved toward another table as though nothing had happened. Her steps were measured, not rushed. Her tray balanced with the same practiced ease as always. At the booth near the window, a family waited for refills, and she approached them with the same calm grace she had carried into every shift. "Can I get you more water?" she asked softly, her voice steady, betraying none of the sting she felt inside. The mother looked at her closely, her eyes flicking briefly toward the booth where the laughter had come from, and gave her a small, almost apologetic smile. "Yes, thank you," the woman replied, her tone warmer than before. The children watched in silence, sensing more than they understood, but they smiled too when she ruffled one of their hair lightly as she placed a glass back on the table. At the counter, a man in a suit asked for another cup of coffee, and she poured it with a careful hand, the steam rising as she set it in front of him. He nodded his thanks, and though he said nothing about what had happened, the pause before his next sip carried something unspoken, a quiet acknowledgement. The more she moved through the restaurant, the more people noticed. Her calmness, her refusal to falter, stood in sharp contrast to the cruelty she had endured minutes before. Diners exchanged glances, some whispering to each other about how wrong the situation had been, others watching her with a kind of quiet admiration. They saw her serve with the same dignity she had always given them, unshaken on the surface, though they could not know the storm that raged in her chest. Her co-workers observed too. From behind the counter, one of the younger waitresses watched her closely, her own hands trembling slightly as she carried a tray of drinks. The busboy, who had earlier looked away, now lifted his head, his expression solemn. Even the manager, who had slipped back into his office, peeked out again, his eyes following her as she carried on with her work without complaint. The men at the booth noticed as well. Their smirks faltered slightly when they saw her ignoring them completely, when they realized that their attempt to humiliate her had not broken her stride. They whispered among themselves, but their laughter was quieter now, less certain. She carried on, her tray filled with plates of food, her face calm and polite as she delivered meals and asked if anyone needed more napkins. The little details she always remembered, like who wanted extra ketchup or who preferred no ice in their glass, were tended to with the same care as before. She refused to let the cruelty of one table dictate the way she treated everyone else. By the time she passed through the room again, a shift had taken place. Diners who had once looked away were now meeting her eyes, some with small nods, others with faint smiles that carried respect. Her quiet resolve had spoken louder than anger ever could. She had shown them that dignity could exist even under the weight of humiliation, that strength did not always need to roar. And though she felt the sting deep within, outwardly she remained steady, becoming, without meaning to, a figure of quiet courage in a room that had witnessed injustice. The atmosphere in the restaurant had begun to settle, the clatter of dishes and the murmur of conversation slowly returning as she carried on with her work. Some diners watched her with quiet respect. Others kept their heads down, but the sharp humiliation of earlier seemed to have dulled. For a moment, it almost seemed as though the incident might be forgotten. Yet the men in the booth were not finished. Their arrogance clung to them like smoke, and they clearly wanted to remind everyone in the room that they were the ones in control. As she passed by with a tray of fresh plates for another table, one of them leaned forward, his voice cutting across the restaurant with deliberate cruelty. "I said we don't want her near our table, can't you hear? Someone else do her job." The words were sharper than before, aimed not only at her but at the manager and the staff who had been too hesitant to intervene. His tone carried the sting of mockery, meant to provoke her and meant for every other diner to hear. The room shifted once again into uneasy silence. Forks stilled. A glass clinked too loudly as someone set it down with nervous hands. She paused, her tray balanced perfectly despite the pounding in her chest. The words burned, harsher than the first insult, and the sound of laughter from the booth stung like salt in an open wound. She lowered her tray onto a nearby counter and turned slightly. Her back straight, her face calm. The manager appeared then, emerging from the office with an expression that betrayed both unease and calculation. He walked toward the booth, his hands raised in a gesture meant to pacify. His voice was low but firm as he spoke, though not to defend her. "If you would prefer another server," he began, "we can arrange that. There's no need for conflict here." Her heart sank. The humiliation was one thing, but to have her own manager prepared to concede to their cruelty threatened to undo her entirely. The customers leaned back in satisfaction, their smirks broadening as though victory was already theirs. Around the restaurant, diners exchanged looks of disbelief, some shaking their heads, others staring at their plates. The silence thickened, charged with the tension of injustice about to be affirmed. But before the moment could settle, she reached into the pocket of her apron. Her fingers closed around a small slip of paper, the same order slip she had written when they first sat down. She stepped forward calmly, her voice steady, not raised but clear enough to carry across the room. "This is the order you gave me when you arrived." She placed the slip on the edge of their table, the ink of her careful handwriting visible for all to see. The details were plain. The dishes requested listed neatly, the drinks marked exactly as they had asked. The timestamp at the top confirmed it without question. The laughter at the booth faltered. The men stared at the paper, their smirks wavering as the truth stared back at them. They had asked her to serve them. They had accepted her presence until they decided to use it as a weapon. Their hypocrisy lay in black and white, undeniable, no matter how they tried to twist their words. The diners who had watched in silence leaned forward, their expressions shifting. Murmurs rippled through the restaurant, some voices rising with indignation, others with admiration for her calm defiance. Even the manager hesitated, his face flushing as he realized that she had exposed the lie not only of the customers but of his willingness to appease them. She did not gloat, did not allow herself a smile. Her posture remained firm, her face composed. The slip of paper spoke for her, proof that her dignity had been intact all along. She stepped back, folding her hands in front of her, and let the silence carry the weight of the truth. The booth that had once laughed so loudly now sat in discomfort, their powers stripped from them by the simplest evidence. In a room that had seen her humiliated, she had turned the tables with nothing but honesty and the quiet strength to stand her ground. The order slip lay on the table like a stone, its weight heavier than paper, heavier than ink. The men who had spent the evening sneering and mocking now stared at it in silence, their faces stripped of arrogance. One shifted uncomfortably, trying to laugh as if the proof meant nothing, but the sound caught in his throat. Another avoided her gaze altogether, staring instead at his glass of water, as though it could offer an escape. The truth was undeniable, and the booth that had once held so much noise now sat muted under the weight of their own hypocrisy. The restaurant itself seemed to hold its breath. Diners who had been watching cautiously leaned forward in their seats. Whispers spread in soft currents across the room. Some shook their heads at the men, others glanced at the waitress with admiration. It was not just the slip of paper that had changed the room, but the way she had presented it, calm and unshaken, her dignity intact despite the cruelty she had endured. The strength in her silence had spoken more than any outburst ever could. A hand clapped once, tentative but firm. From a table near the front, heads turned as a woman in her 40s nodded toward the waitress and continued to clap, her face bright with approval. Within moments, another diner joined in, then another, until the sound spread through the restaurant. Applause filled the air, steady and sincere, washing over the tables with a rhythm that left no doubt of where the loyalty in the room had shifted. The men in the booth flushed red, shrinking under the sound that only hours before would have felt impossible. The waitress stood still, her hands folded neatly in front of her apron, her face calm, though her chest swelled with emotion. She did not bow her head. She met the eyes of those who clapped, one by one, her gratitude shining through in the steadiness of her gaze. She had not asked for their support, but now that it had come, it felt like a tide lifting her higher than she had ever been in that room. The manager, who had hesitated before, stepped forward now with a firmness that had been absent earlier. His voice carried across the restaurant, clear and sharp. "No one," he said, his eyes sweeping over the diners before settling on the men at the booth, "will disrespect my staff in this establishment." His tone was not just a declaration. It was a rebuke, directed at the men who had mistaken cruelty for strength. The booth that had laughed so loudly now sat in silence, their bravado dissolved. One of them muttered under his breath, but his words were drowned out by the applause that still echoed across the restaurant. Another looked as though he might argue, but the manager's stare cut him off before he could begin. The balance of the room had shifted completely. Where once they had felt powerful, they were now exposed and isolated. Every pair of eyes turned against them. The waitress felt the shift as well. For so long she had been overlooked, treated as part of the background. Yet here she stood, not broken by humiliation, but honored by recognition. The applause was not for her uniform or her service. It was for her strength, for the way she had carried herself when cruelty tried to strip her down. The manager remained by her side, his posture protective. He spoke once more, this time addressing the diners who had begun to quiet, his voice filled with conviction. "This place is for everyone who walks through the door, but if you cannot show respect, then you do not belong here." His words were met with a chorus of nods, and the room erupted again in supportive applause. The waitress stood taller than she had all evening, the truth finally resting, not as a burden, but as a victory. The men who had sought to humiliate her could no longer meet her eyes. The restaurant had turned, and with it, so had her place within it. For the first time, she was seen not only as someone who served, but as someone whose dignity demanded acknowledgement. The booth that had once been filled with smug laughter was now quiet, the men shifting in their seats with restless movements, their eyes cast down as the weight of the room pressed against them. The applause had broken their confidence, shattering the image of control they had tried to project. One of them reached for his jacket, fumbling awkwardly as though he could not get out of the restaurant fast enough. Another muttered something under his breath, but the sound was drowned out by the steady murmur of diners who had clearly chosen their side. Together, the group rose, their arrogance drained, their smirks gone. They walked toward the door, not with the swagger they had entered with, but with the hunched shoulders of men who knew they had been defeated, not by force, but by truth. As the door closed behind them, a hush lingered for a moment, before the room filled again with conversation, this time, with a brighter note. Some diners smiled at the waitress as she passed. Others nodded in quiet respect. A child at one of the tables clapped his small hands together, mimicking the applause that had shaken the room only minutes earlier. The waitress felt the heat of tears rise in her chest, but she refused to let them fall. She straightened her back, pressed her shoulders back, and lifted her chin with quiet pride. Her co-workers gathered near her, no longer silent or hesitant. One of the younger servers whispered a soft, "Well done," her eyes shining with admiration. The busboy, who had earlier avoided looking at her, now carried trays with an extra determination, his posture almost protective, as though he wanted to carry some of her burden for her. Even the manager, who had nearly faltered under the pressure, approached her with a sincerity she had not seen in him before. He spoke in a low voice, just enough for her to hear, promising that what had happened would not be forgotten and that she had his full support. The shift continued, but it no longer felt the same. Where once the clatter of plates and the murmur of conversations had pressed down like noise, now each sound carried with it a sense of lightness. Diners asked for refills with warmth in their tone, some lingering in their thanks longer than usual. A couple paused her mid-step to tell her how impressed they were by her composure. Others smiled at her knowingly, a quiet acknowledgement of the strength she had shown. She moved through the restaurant as she always did, carrying plates, refilling glasses, and checking on tables. But tonight, there was something different. Each step felt steadier, each interaction heavier with meaning. She was not invisible anymore, not just another uniform passing by. She had stood in the storm of humiliation and had not only endured it but turned it back on those who tried to strip her dignity. By the end of the night, when the last tables were cleared and the lights dimmed, she stood in the quiet of the dining room for a moment, her hands resting on the back of a chair. The reflection in the window showed her not only as a waitress but as a woman who had proven that strength was not in loud words or sharp comebacks but in the quiet refusal to break. Her coworkers passed behind her, their faces lighter, their steps quicker, as though they too had drawn strength from what they had witnessed. She tied her apron loose and stepped toward the door, her body tired but her spirit unshaken. That night, she left not as someone who had been humiliated but as someone who had turned cruelty into a moment of truth. She became, for those who had seen, a symbol of dignity carried with calm, a reminder that respect could be demanded not by force but by steadfast grace. And though tomorrow would bring another shift, another round of orders and trays and endless tasks, she would walk into it taller than before, knowing she had claimed her place with nothing more than the quiet strength of her resolve.